Good morning, everybody. I'm Brendan Lodge. Just left JSSI as a full-time employee and returned to the arena of aircraft sales. But I've got a very interesting panel here for you today, a mixture of experience and youth, carefully chosen by me. Okay, and I'm going to start off by introducing the youngest member of the team, which is Mark Abbott, obviously. Mark. I'm going to keep this very brief so we have plenty of time. Mark cut his career in the Royal Air Force, where he was 15 years, achieving the rank of chief, I think you mentioned. Left after 15 years, started working with private jets, now has his business, plane audits. He's a technical advisor, for want of a better word, engineering consultant, or whatever you want to call him. So that's Mark. To my right, immediately, I've got Alan Cunningham, consummate deal doer from both sides, representing both the owners and the buyers. He has recently taken his practice from Ernst & Young to, now get this right, Hunton Andrews Kurth, which is an American firm, and he's set up in the UK, but has the US capability as well. Very, very experienced lawyer. Next to Mark, we've got James Hughes, who's my colleague at Tangmere. Consummate deal doer from a broker perspective, lots of experience of transactions, both buying and selling. Then to represent the MRO world, we have our youngest panel member, not Mark, I'm afraid. So we've got Ben Newman from InFlight. Ben is the business development manager at InFlight, and he was recognized in November, if you were there, by the BBGA for his Excellence in Aviation Award for the next generation. So well done, Ben. And finally, the ultimate king of deals. We have Dustin, who I've personally known since about 2002. He's done everything in aviation, from being a pilot to selling aircraft, operating aircraft. Hangar 8 was a massive achievement, sold as a PLC company, and he continues now with Volare Aviation. So much experience, and we're very, very pleased to have you on the panel. So basically, let's kick it off. So I'm going to start off. The PPI forms an integral part of the APA in terms of negotiations. The work scope we're going to be discussing later on. But I think what I'll do is first ask Alan to say what exactly is a PPI from the legal perspective.
Thank you, Brendan. Good morning, everyone. Right, so within an aircraft purchase agreement, there is one purpose and one purpose only of a PPI, and that is to check and make sure that the aircraft is in the negotiated delivery condition. That is it. And so there's really, I'd say, two parts in the contract to that. One is to negotiate the delivery condition properly, not to overload it, but not to undercook it. Second, then to have a work scope, a PPI work scope that is appropriate to check that delivery condition. Then to assess where the discrepancies are as against the delivery condition, rectify them, and go straight to delivery. That is it. It's very, very simple, but often it takes probably about half of the entire agreement with the inspection and the process for rectification.
Okay. So why do PPIs go badly? That's the question we're going to be looking at today. And I think we've used the word work scope already. And I know, Dustin, for instance, I'm going to ask you this next question. You were quite vocal when we pulled the team together in terms of the work scope and what it should and shouldn't be doing. So do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brendan. I'd love to. I think the main reason people struggle with PPIs is you take a transaction from being a willing buyer and a willing seller and chuck them into 4 or 5 different parties, an MRO, a lawyer, a tax advisor, some other advisor, and 2 brokers. And as long as you've defined exactly what you're looking for in a PPI, and the seller knows what he's selling and the buyer knows what he's buying, you generally don't have any problems with them. The issue becomes when the seller turns around and says, well, I'm selling my perfect aeroplane, but yes, I forgot the microwave that we never use doesn't work, and the light in the back we don't use doesn't work. And oh yeah, our pilots never use that. And suddenly the never use that and don't know about is $300,000. and the buyer's saying, well, even though we may never use those, I'd quite like them to work. I think where you head off into with this process is that the correct way to do this is define a PPI as defects from what should be a working aeroplane. Not necessarily airworthiness, because a lot of owners don't care if the wings fall off their aeroplane. They are very concerned if their microwave and the espresso machine doesn't work. So entry into a pre-buy should be everything on the aeroplane works, whether it's new or 10 years old, and then the process should be an MRO that can identify whether they do or don't work. And that tends to get lost in the process more than anything. So it's keeping that on track, and that's where your broker gets involved.
Thanks, Dustin. And I know we've discussed one of the things that can happen in the PPI process is that someone says, look, you know, the 48-month inspection is due in 6 months' time. Let's pull that forwards, or maybe in a year's time, or whatever. Is that a good idea to do that? And I'm going to ask that to Mark, first of all.
Thank you, Brendan. I think that the point of the PPI is to discuss the scope, and it is pointless pulling forward maintenance just for the sake of a PPI. Sorry. The aircraft, normally if it's priced correctly, the fact that the buyer knows that maintenance is coming up it should be a very strong part of the pricing of that aircraft. Pulling maintenance just for the sake of reassurance is pretty pointless. It causes a lot of disruption, a lot of extra cost, and much as the engine guys will tell you, going in early, you're finding problems that don't really need to be addressed at that point. So it causes a lot of headaches. If it is appropriate for the seller to agree to have that done, then it's obviously a very good point, but it confuses the issue as to what is relevant to the purchase of the aircraft.
Thanks, Mark. And Dustin, do you want to add a bit to that? I think you made some points.
I think what we're articulating there is the seller shouldn't have to pay twice. So the maintenance status of the aeroplane is priced into the deal when you sign the deal. Putting the aeroplane in for a very detailed level 3 PPI and bringing inspections through that may not be due in some cases for 20 years is not a reasonable expectation on the seller, because they have priced their aircraft to sell for its maintenance status, to then double bill them for a load of maintenance that is not due and they gain nothing from by doing early. It is unreasonable and not commercial, and that's where PPIs fall out.
Okay, thank you. So James, how crucial is the role of the broker in going through the PPI process?
Well, I think you feel like the peace envoy on a lot of deals. I mean, it's. I think the issue from my side, in terms of the broker relationship in the deal, is there are so many stakeholders involved in an aircraft transaction. From as Dustin's highlighted, the tax guys, the guys providing the ownership structure for the buyer and seller, the PPI facility have obviously got a commercial interest, and I think for me, really, from a deal perspective, it comes down to 3 points. It's really ultimately about the timing, the commercial negotiation on the purchase price, and also the pragmatism of the buyer. And I actually think that what we're seeing is and I can only speak today as from my own experience over the years of doing a few deals a year and making a living in this industry, that the buyers that feel that they have negotiated a poor commercial deal at the front end then try and claw back in their mind the commercial or the value in enhancing the work scope and adding all this stuff that's not needed. And we actually had a deal very recently fall through because the buyer wanted to do a gear overhaul that was done 2 years ago. He wanted to do a full boroscope when the whole sections were just done, and the seller was just like, to us as the acting broker, how should we handle it? And I'm like, well, there's not many aircraft available. I think they'd better go shopping. So they've now come back to the table, having gone shopping, and realised that their points were ill-advised. And actually, that links in again to the team that's involved, and that these buyers, in my opinion, need to ensure that they're well advised on the whole process.
Thanks, James. So, one of the parties that gets involved in PPIs that definitely can get caught in the middle is the poor old MRO. Okay, and so Ben's here to sort of put it from the MRO perspective. They do perform a crucial role, but as I said, they can get caught in the crossfire. So, you know, in terms of at an MRO, what do you see as the contentious points, and you know, how do you tend to deal with it, and what can be there's a lot of questions here. What can be the consequences of it going wrong for the MRO?
Thank you, Brendan. I think the biggest thing for an MRO is having a clear understanding of what it is that our role is there. So we're not there on behalf of the buyer, the seller, the lawyer, anyone else. It's purely to deliver that aeroplane to the delivery inspection, ensuring that all defects are raised, either airworthy or non-airworthy, and then that clear communication channel through the broker, ideally, or directly to the seller and the buyer to make sure that the aeroplane that we're about to RTS and say it's safe and airworthy is actually at the delivery condition as well. Dustin alluded to the microwave working. Now, to us, that would be deemed as a non-airworthy item. To the buyer, I imagine that is an airworthy item that is crucial. And it's finding that balance between who we're discussing it with. We discussed all week about communication being a key point. And I think for us, it's that communication piece of who we're discussing it with, who we're seeking the approval from, and then how we can smooth that process. And from my experience so far is the broker, we've seen all ends of the spectrum, from left of arc of the broker delivering a buyer and a seller to the facility and disappearing until after the PPIs process is finished, to brokers that sit on the facility all week, all 10 days of the inspection, and will micromanage from both the buyer and the seller's side to smooth that process. When we've seen that, the PPI process goes really, really smoothly, in my opinion, and it makes a big, big difference. When we're dealing directly from our tech services department to the buyer and the seller, we get really caught up in the crossfire, like you said, and that makes it a much longer process. And then we start waiting for the end of the inspections before we can start rectifying any work, which then the PPI is going to be in the facility 3, 4, 5 weeks instead of a week, maybe 2 weeks maximum to start fixing it.
Thank you very much. So in the moderator notes that I had to read before doing this, it does say, try not to let your delegates get into a position where they start selling. Okay, but I'm going to give Mark Abbott that opportunity now. So Mark, what can a seller do to make the PPI process a little bit easier for themselves?
Simply, it's the vendor due diligence. Is make sure your aircraft, the records, are in a position where you can present them to a buyer, where you're able to answer the questions that are raised quickly, efficiently, and it's easy to find the information they need. Time kills deals, and not being prepared, not ready for your aircraft to be inspected causes those delays.
And Dustin, in terms of formulating a work scope when you're a buyer, okay, how would you go about doing that? So you've got to negotiate this, don't forget. So,
yeah, I think there's 2 lines of thought here. As somebody that owns a business that predominantly only buys and sells, and we have an MRO that's purely geared to buying and selling, the bit that is usually lost in every transaction that Mark's alluded to is not many people, very few in fact, unless they have in-house engineers, take technical advice on what they're actually agreeing to as part of the sales purchase or process or the buy purchase. For somebody who buys very quickly, usually in less than 14 days, and we do probably 10 pre-buys a month, what you want is a seller that knows exactly what they've got and exactly what they're entering into. And if you have that and they've taken that advice before getting it, it makes the process so much easier, because we have no interest in rebuilding an aeroplane. We just want to buy what they said they're selling. And some technical advice on the way in and on the way out makes a big difference. And popping back to the MRO point, where MROs get stuffed in the middle is because they're not told what the contract is usually, what either side are looking for, and it's not articulated to them what they're trying to achieve. And they are maintaining an aeroplane, not necessarily testing things to see if they meet a delivery condition.
thank you. Okay, so Alan, do you see a lot of your clients instructing someone like Mark prior to the formation of the work scope?
Yes. So what the client would normally do is go to the operator or go to a specialist inspector, and what we would do when acting for the seller is, when we negotiate the delivery condition, to speak to the technical advisor to make sure that there is a full expectation that the aircraft will meet that delivery condition. And if there is an expectation that it will not, it needs to be changed. But I think, just going back to your point a moment ago, what can a seller do? The PPI is the most dangerous part of the transaction for a seller. So what the seller really wants to do is make sure that the delivery condition is realistic, make sure that the work scope is not overreached. If you have a nervous buyer who just throws a load of delivery conditions which are irrelevant, or a load of work scope which is irrelevant, it needs to be pushed back. But the most important point is to get a large deposit, which is a hard deposit, so that the buyer cannot walk away. The whole tension in a PPI is the seller does not want the buyer to be able to walk away for a spurious reason, and lots of buyers want the ability to walk away if they find something unexpected. And that is the tension within the contract. So the best way to remove that tension and give people certainty is to have what we would call in the trade a hard deposit and a sizable deposit, because if at technical acceptance the buyer can walk away for any reason, then the APA is really just an option to purchase. And the buyer can walk away and leave the seller with a huge bill, with loads of downtime, and loads of maintenance that otherwise would not have become due.
So James, thank you, Alan. James, you've seen a lot of PPIs going on. How many of the buyers and sellers you've seen actually use someone like Mark to be there as their technical representative?
Almost always as the values in the aircraft climb. And in actual fact, in relation to the broker, you asked me earlier about the broker's job. On the lower value deals that we've worked on over the years, that the aircraft sub 5 million, the reliance is on the broker, and again, my own experience. So generally, if you're selling a Gulfstream, it's a little bit more of a well-funded flight department, or the owner might be, in a different wealth position. I think in relation to your point earlier, in delivery condition, I think actually, it doesn't always work because of the timing of when a seller wants to bring an aircraft to the market, but that is also the broker's job. You can actually get ahead of the delivery condition before you even put the aircraft to the market. And what I mean by that, we have a project right now and the owner's saying, well, let's get rid of the aeroplane. And well, actually, if they wait until March, when we've done a series of detail 4 inspection with a prop overhaul, blah, 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 it's actually going to be the ultimate time to do it. So when the buyer comes and says, well, I want to do this, I want to do that, well, it's already done. So again, linking back to my first point, that it's all about the timing and pragmatism of the buyer on in relation to how quickly he wants to get the deal done. Because ultimately, once these airplanes go into PPI, as you said, they can get stuck for months, parts issues, blah, blah, blah. So I think that the more they elaborate on these things, really the PPI is there to confirm what the aircraft is. And you pick up, when you're buying it, well, when I'm buying an aeroplane, I put together a story. I want to know who's flown it, where it's been operated to, who's maintained it, and you pick up a picture of the life of the aircraft. So really the PPI process, as Dustin said earlier, that it's just a confirmation of what the seller is selling you effectively.
Yeah, thank you. So, both buyer and seller, I'm sure, are hoping that there are not going to be too many discrepancies. Seller particularly, because if they're found, he then has to pay for them. Okay, but the job of actually deciding what a discrepancy is falls with the MRO. So Ben, tell me, what is a discrepancy?
So the discrepancy can be broken down from our side into two subjects. So you've got airworthy, non-airworthy, like we've mentioned previously. The airworthy, from what we see, is always liable to the seller, and the non-airworthy always seems to fall in the middle ground where the buyer expects it to be done, the seller's saying it's not fundamental to the aircraft condition. And our role is on behalf of the OEM, so we're an Embraer-approved service centre, is to deliver in accordance with the aircraft manuals and as per the delivery instructions from the APA, and then in accordance with the manuals of the aircraft operator. To us, it's making sure that we break that down. We seek advice from the contact centre at Embraer or whoever the delegation may be to ensure that what we are saying is factually correct. When we have a problem is when it sits in the middle ground. So it's just within limits, for example, means the windscreens, you've got 60 hours more flying time before those windscreens need replacing. The buyer does not want to be buying an airplane and then in 60 hours' time, he's then sitting back on the ground for a windscreen replacement. But legally and by the book, it is not an airworthy defect at the time. And that's where we've started to see our biggest challenges, and the education piece is fundamental there. But that's where having a camo from both sides, buyer and seller, instead of dealing with somebody that works in the outer office of the high net worth individual that's buying their first aeroplane on behalf of the buyer, they've never had any experience in this, they don't know the technical detail. We always recommend either subcontracting a camo department in, or somebody within their operational department to take that on and give some serious advice. Because if we're dealing with the PA for the high net worth gentleman that's buying an aeroplane for the first time, it's really, really difficult. And that's where the broker then gets stuck in a bit of a hard place as well, because we're all trying to educate somebody that is still learning at the same time. If you've got a camo, or you've got somebody of experience from an engineering background, a Part 145 background, that understands what we're discussing, they can then help explain it in a different terms to the individuals.
Thank you. Yep, okay. So, I mean, I've been involved in probably, if I've added up, probably over 100 transactions in my career, and looked at many APAs. And there's a bit of a clumsy clause you see appearing in a lot of the APAs, which is basically along the lines of all systems working as per the manufacturer's specifications. Okay, and I know it is a clause that can cause massive...
I wouldn't call that clumsy.
Yeah, I'd go the other way actually and say airworthiness is probably a complete misnomer, because it's such a widespread. I think the only way you can define a delivery condition is saying the delivery condition is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever those points are, and they generally are fit, form and function, i.e. everything works as it was designed. So you take your windscreen, yes, it works as it's designed, but it's beyond fair wear and tear, it's cracked and damaged. You can have damage history, you can have corrosion within manufacturers. You would define delivery condition with probably 10 clauses are very, very standard. Airworthiness is a nice thing to have in there, but it's probably the least critical out of a delivery condition of an aeroplane. So I think where MROs are not equipped to do PPIs is they don't function in a world of defects. They function in a world of, this is the maintenance manual, does it meet the criteria of the maintenance manual or not, which is often nothing to do with a purchase agreement. So actually having a delivery condition which is concise and detailed, and is always less than 1 page if it's done properly, and a defect is any discrepancy that does not meet the delivery condition, simple as.
I mean, there are many buyers who just do not know what they're looking at. And because of their ignorance and therefore nervousness, they just throw a load of stuff into the transaction. When you've got a buyer and a seller who are either in the trade or who are well advised, the PPI work scope and the delivery condition and the assessment is really, really quick. Because, somebody like Dustin or James, Mark, they will know precisely what they're looking at, and and they will tell a buyer what they do need and what they don't need, and they'll tell a seller what they have to do, and they will trust that advice. But when you've got, I remember having a deal that was stuck in jet aviation in Singapore for months because the DVD player didn't work. They couldn't find a replacement. It was no longer serviceable. And the buyer was holding out for a DVD player that they were never going to use.
And that comes under the all systems working as per manufacturer specifications.
It does, but if the seats don't recline, then that's a problem. But if the DVD player doesn't work, what you can have within a delivery condition is a definition of obsolescence. And if you have obsolete items, you can carve those out of the delivery condition.
Makes sense. James, do you want to say something?
Just to elaborate on what Alan was saying, I think actually a major point that in the delivery condition is where the aircraft is going and on what registry it's going on. And a good example of that, and I sound like a broken record with the word timing, but we get a lot of LOIs come in and they say require an export certificate of airworthiness, and the UK, it's a UK registered aircraft. Well, if it's going on to the FAA, it doesn't actually need an export survey. So you quite often get some legal counsels that are less familiar with the asset class than others will say, no, we have to have it, right? Well, UK CAA, as everybody knows, will take longer to produce an export survey than say the Isle of Man or the 2 Reg. So I think the climate for offshore jurisdictions in relation to registrations, like I live on the island of Guernsey. I mean, the Guernsey reg is very quick turnaround. Similarly with San Marino, we just did a project with Alan with San Marino. It's making the delivery conditions easier, but if you wait for a UK export CMO, I don't know what's the latest time. It's like 2 months. Well, there we go. So again, for the PPI facility, I guess it's going on your ramp until and I mean that links in with the release to service and delivery conditions. So I think again it comes back to education.
Okay, thank you. One last question, then we'll go on to the Slido questions. But to Ben, a lot of cynical people out there say MROs want to make loads of money out of PPIs. They want to find everything wrong. They want to fix it. They want to charge for it. What do you say to that? Why do you do PPIs?
So we had this conversation at the Aircraft Transaction Masterclass in September when me and Brendan delivered this presentation to that audience. And everyone in the room had a stigma that the MRO makes an awful lot of money out of a PPI, and we don't need to ever see that aeroplane again. We're quite happy to fleece at that moment in time for every penny we can. And to us, a PPI is the starting point to a relationship, in my opinion, with the buyer. And that aeroplane is clearly within our capabilities. And the way I see it is if we can deliver that aeroplane nice and quickly back to them so they've got it flying, they've got their new asset available, they're then going to come back again in 12 months' time. So we've made a real ploy to try and keep the PPI as short and as sweet as we can. We want the hangar space back available for our next project. We're normally, hopefully, trying to book them in back-to-back to keep our efficiency up. And we've seen, so there's a legacy we did in May, and we did a PPI for it. We've seen that aircraft 14 times since, either for AOG, for line support. They fly an awful lot of hours on the aeroplane, and we've seen it once for its scheduled maintenance. As an MRO, our profit margin will be much more significant from a 144-month check that aeroplane brings than it is a £40,000, £50,000 PPI that's just getting in the way. For me, it's that bigger picture and it's that relationship establishment more than it is making a quick buck for 10 days in the start.
Do you agree with that, Dustin, or do you?
Look, I think it's very easy to give MROs a big kicking for money making off the back of a PPI, but at the end of the day, it's the buyer and the seller that decide they want to rebuild the aeroplane as part of the inspection. I think badly run MROs, when they run an inspection, don't really know what they're looking at and are not following the contract. And I've had just as much fun going to an MRI and saying, "Why did you look at that? It's not in your remit." And they've gone, "Well, we thought we should do." Great, well, you can fix it and pay for it. So depending on which side of the coin you're sat on, and once again, how good your advisors are, you can either break an MRO and make sure they lose money on a PPI, or you can use them very usefully to produce a very nice aeroplane and make sure the buyer and the seller do. So there's knowing what you're entering into, and then there's managing the process.
Okay, thanks, Dustin. So let's go on to the Slido questions. Mark, that first one, many OEMs have transitioned from PPI to PPE, evaluation, not inspection, depending on the aircraft type. How would you explain to an owner the difference? I've personally not come across a PPE, but...
Yeah, it's terminology. It's the same thing addressed with a different name. Explaining to the owner the difference is when you call it an inspection, a lot of people then expect that it's to it's a critical examination, which PPE is exactly the same. It's evaluating the aircraft to a set of conditions that are laid out, and normally in the manual. There is no difference. How you explain it is the way in which you address the owner or the buyer and explain where you are. During COVID, I often represented both sides as buyer and seller, and it still continues now. A technical issue is very black and white. There's an answer. What isn't black and white is who pays, and that then it comes down to whether it's a willing buyer or a willing seller.
Yeah. Okay, you mentioned COVID. I was immediately thinking when I saw PPE of Michelle Moan and all the money she made out of it, but sorry, a little joke there. Next question. Time kills deals. No, that's not the one. Okay, well, we can answer this one. Does it make sense to have a level 3 PPI if the jet is on programs, or will a level 1 suffice? James, from a broker's perspective, do you want to?
Well, I think there's been a lot of focus so far on, the broker because he's the easy target, or he or she's the easy target, the MRO facility because you're in it to make money. We haven't actually heard about the operators yet. And actually, I think a PPI really shows how an aeroplane's been operated, and particularly if you get an aircraft. I'm quite fortunate. In my career, I've only had two bad PPIs to caption this panel. And both of them were through aircraft that were predominantly on charter operations with, dare I say it, owners that were probably sold the dream in terms of the cost of operation. And what we got actually was that one particular that stands out in my mind was an operator that just didn't want to let this revenue stream go. And I think that this is the thing that people sometimes, we see operators, some operators can get very nervous when the PPI comes, because obviously if they've not been doing their job and they've been charging the guy for the camo or whatever, then sorry to have the dig at the operators, but it's just.
I think that no one size fits all. A level 3 PPI doesn't really mean anything to me. Whether you perform that on a 1-year-old aircraft or a 20-year-old aircraft, you gain nothing from ripping an airplane to bits. What you do is you look at an aircraft in its stage of life and decide, is it coming up to massive inspection? Should I do that as my inspection? Or if it's due nothing, what is the point in looking at things that aren't due for 10 years? I think people get badly advised, mainly by brokers, that what level of PPI is acceptable to buy. And that's usually due to ignorance and lack of understanding as to what a PPI is, or any fundamental understanding of the technicals of an aircraft. Generally speaking, a PPI should be a detailed visual inspection of an aircraft and a review of the records. If during that detailed visual inspection you find things that do not work or ring alarm bells, you should have the right to then extrapolate from that and look at stuff that could fundamentally be a problem. Taking all the panels off it and testing and measuring everything that may well not have met criteria even when it was fitted new is absolutely pointless unless you're an MRO and want to make a lot of money.
Okay. So you've kind of, that next question, time kills deals, okay, Dustin. I don't know if you want to kind of follow on from what you've just said and answer the question about, is it something that brokers like to keep the time short?
I think everybody likes to keep the time short. Within my business, we run an MRO and a team that are licensed engineers that just do pre-buys. So they advise during the buy and the sell process. And we would expect to be able to send 2 guys out to an aircraft, do the records in a day and a visual inspection in 2 days and pay on the 4th day. And we do that on a weekly basis without any issues. So, I see no reason to put an aeroplane into a facility for a month to rebuild it, unless, of course, it has a load of scheduled maintenance coming up, in which case there's every reason to do so.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. MROs will naturally try and put a menu together, a PPI level 1, 2 or 3. It's irrelevant until you've looked at the aircraft and decided where it is in the program and what depth you need to go. And that normally we talk about a PPI. How about a pre-PPI? Somebody who's knowledgeable looks at the aircraft and advises you on what depth of inspection you need.
Yeah, okay.
And on timing, it again comes to the point about the seller wants to keep the buyer in the deal, but the buyer may want an option to try and get out the deal. And so often a well-advised buyer will put in a long stop date into an APA to say that if the seller cannot put the aircraft in the delivery condition by a particular date and time,
yep,
then the buyer can walk and get back its deposit. That time period has to be realistic. I'd say more than 90 days is unusual. Less than 30 days is just too tight. But normally the buyer will not wait forever for the aircraft to be put in delivery condition.
Okay. And just, and I can put this one to Ben, talking about the time it takes, how much of an issue is getting parts at the moment so that, something needs replacing and you just can't find the parts anywhere? And what does that do for you as an MRO?
It causes a lot of delays, and it upsets an awful lot of people because it's not just the aeroplane that's got the parts issue. It's the aeroplane that's lined up to come into that maintenance bay the second that PPI is finished. And it's that knock-on effect. It makes us look incompetent necessarily to the buyer, that we can't find the parts. Either we're restricted for where we're shopping for those parts or the availability of the parts, which we see an awful lot at the moment. But it has a knock-on effect all the way through. And the airplane's going to be sitting in our hangar. It's not going to be being worked, and it's going to be incurring either some parking charges, which it didn't necessarily need. It's going to be slowing down a deal, but also it's just getting in the way of our productivity for moving on to the next one. And I think the parts availability is one thing, and the approvals to order those parts is the other. There's a question that was, I think, from Norm Order there, about should we be rectifying things as we go through the PPI. Our strongest recommendation is to leave that downtime as short as we can, is we're going to be rectifying it anyway. If we flag an airworthy defect, that airplane, regardless if it sells or not, isn't leaving the facility until it's airworthy again. So all airworthy defects, in my opinion, should be approved as we go along. If we flag something on day 2, it's got another 8 days in the facility, we can have that rectified, ideally, before the end of the inspections. And then what we said about time kills deals, that's the time point that kills a deal, not the 5 to 10 days for the inspection, depending on the level. It's the 5, 10, 15, 20 days after, where we're still waiting for decisions from the seller to approve things that they don't have a choice but to approve. It's just whether they approve it in part of a deal or as part of regaining their own aeroplane back to fly it back out for their operations.
Okay. And just following on that parts availability issue at the moment, Alan, if an aircraft has the APA has a long stop clause in it,
Yep.
and the availability of parts is causing it to go on beyond that, does the seller have any protection there, or does the buyer still get the opportunity to walk?
It depends how it's negotiated. So the seller is protected in the sense that the seller will not be in breach of contract. The seller cannot be sued because something beyond its control has not been capable of being delivered. So if there's a proper force majeure clause in the contract, the seller will have protection from being sued. But the seller will not be able to stop the buyer from walking away from the deal if the buyer is unable to put the aircraft in delivery condition. And if that is because there is a part which is unavailable, then that is the risk for the seller. It comes back down to the obsolescence point, because if a system or a part is obsolete, it can't be rectified, it can't be put in the delivery condition. But no, the long stop date will allow a buyer to walk eventually. If the buyer is motivated to buy the aircraft, they'll stay in the deal.
Okay. Yep. So there's an engine program question there. This was kind of covered yesterday, and Al did ask me not to tread on the toes of the engine PPI people, like Del Rey down there. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to shelve that particular question. Come and speak to us afterwards if you want the answer to that one. We've got 1 minute 31 seconds left, so 4 minutes. Okay. All right. In that case, then I just want to raise the corrosion word. Okay. And I'm sure there'll be a bit of debate on this, but I'm going to start out in terms of the definition of corrosion, what's within tolerances and what is not within tolerances. And I think I'm going to start with Ben on this one, okay? And how often is it a problem in PPIs?
As soon as we find it, it becomes a problem. And most aeroplanes have got some form of corrosion somewhere on them. Now, if we're looking at a level 3 PPI and we're putting a magnifying glass on and we're looking into some significant detail, you will always find corrosion somewhere on that aeroplane. For us, it's then getting that feedback from the OEM on what level is that corrosion going to be a problem. And if the OEM believes that that corrosion is fine, is manageable, then we will raise it as a finding, but it doesn't necessarily mean it needs a rectification. The time it becomes a big problem is when we find corrosion that needs fixing, and it shouldn't have been looked at for 6 more years, let's say on the thrust reversers on an aircraft. They're due at 12-year point, the aircraft's 6 years old. Suddenly we've got a big problem that we've found something that wouldn't be covered by the engine provider necessarily because it's been looked at out of scope, and then someone needs to be liable for the rectification and the payment of that. That falls to the seller, who's now very, very angry that we've found corrosion on his aeroplane that we shouldn't be flying for another 6 years, and it was flying fine with it, it would still probably fly fine without it. However, because we found it, it needs fixing, and it causes a real conflict between both parties.
Okay. Well, Dustin, I mean, you've spent the last few years bringing older aircraft back into more serviceable life. How much has corrosion been an issue when you've been buying and selling?
Well, I don't think corrosion is an issue. I think you hit the nail on the head. The scope of PPI is the issue. If you go and look in an area where you know that there's going to be corrosion and you're not required to look for 10 years, then reasonably you're going to find it. We all know which aeroplanes are more susceptible in certain areas, and replacing the wings on your Gulfstream 450 every time you look at it in a PPI every year, because even when it's repaired it will fail the next year, doesn't make it a better aeroplane, and it doesn't mean that it wouldn't fly for its next 96-month inspection. So if the seller's ill-advised and allows its aircraft to go into an inspection that allows it to look in areas that aren't due for 8 years, tough, You learn the expensive way. You should have spent 10 grand on getting someone who could advise you properly.
Okay, and so James, from a broker perspective, how often have you seen corrosion rear its head in?
Yeah, it's the age-old problem, is that I think going into the PPI as the broker, you work on the premise of probability. And that comes back to the original point that I made earlier about what the aircraft's been doing in its life. If it's been operating in environments of -30 in the winter and +30 in the summer, to a speck of de-icing fluid that's not the European or whatever, the likelihood of corrosion in certain points is obviously going to be going to be there. But I mean, ultimately, all of this stuff in PPIs is the buyer's opportunity to negotiate a discount, right? That's really what they're after. It's generally where I see these things going, if it's obviously outside of the tolerances.
Okay.
I think if there are known corrosion issues with a particular model, so for example, the CJ4 has a service bulletin on the cockpit windows and the cockpit side windows, and many buyers of CJ4s are now requiring that service bulletin to be completed either as part of a PPI or before a PPI starts. And if corrosion is found, that can result in skin replacement and downtime of 3, 4, 5, 6 months and a big bill. So where there are, I think, known issues with a particular model, buyers are much more likely to investigate. But again, it's, people will often talk about over-lawyering a contract, but I think you can over-engineer a PPI and a work scope, and you're asking for things that you just do not need.
Yeah. Okay, just mop up on a couple of these Slido questions, okay? There's an interesting one there, probably another one for you, Alan, here. What do you do when the seller simply negates the airworthiness defects during PPE and stalls the process?
Well, the seller is not getting his or her aircraft back because it's not going to be released to service. If there's an airworthiness issue, then Ben is not going to release the aircraft to service and it doesn't move. Unless you're going to tow it across the airfield and give it to another MRO who'll pass it. Once it's airworthiness, the aircraft is stuck.
Yeah. Okay, Al, can I open it up to the floor for questions if there's any? Wow.
Yeah, very quiet.
Either we were useless or we were brilliant. I'm not sure which.
Let's take that second question.
Okay, all right.
Do buyers like to get a third-party opinion in terms of valuation, or is this more common for banks and main operators? I mean, the operator is key to everything. The operator helps everybody, but I don't think that buyers like to get a third-party opinion. It's the opinion of the operator that counts.
Yeah, probably I'd go along with that. Okay, well, thank you, distinguished panel here. Big round of applause, please, for the panelists.